What is happening with DC Comics? How do those properties affect what's going on in the back issue market? We'll explore that on this video from Bronzeville Comics. Hey there, comic book community. This is Jim from Bronzeville Comics coming to you with another video. If you like the content on the channel, please subscribe, like, comment, do all that great stuff. Also, follow us on other socials. We're on Instagram, Bronzeville_comics. We're on Whatnot. I just completed my first Whatnot auction last night. That was a lot of fun. Didn't go exactly as I expected. I lost all the information I had input. And also, we have an eBay store at ebay.com/Bronzeville Comics. Let's get into this. So last week, Variety reported that Warner Brothers Discovery was looking into a major overhaul of the DC Comics entertainment properties. Warner Brothers and Discovery recently merged in a huge $40+ billion deal. And part of Warner Brothers' value is in these properties that they have of these iconic superheroes, specifically Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman. And they also generate a lot of other revenue streams in merchandising and toys, as well as the live action films that we spend most of our time talking about, and also on the comic books. That's included in this as well. Well, DC has a number of projects in progress, both theatrical releases, HBO Max properties, both movies and TV series. And in recent weeks, we already saw DC shuffling their schedule, basically moving back the release dates of Black Adam, Aquaman, Flash, and moving up into 2022, the release date of Shazam 2. And I wonder if this was related to the upcoming merger, if they knew what was coming. And this is one of the things that they kind of did beforehand, because they were looking to re-examine the properties. Now, I do believe we're going to see all of those movies. However, this also comes on the heels of the continued off-the-set problems that Ezra Miller has been having. There was the incident in Hawaii where they were arrested. I don't believe at this point formal charges have been filed. And there were reports that Warner Brothers was meeting to discuss the future of Miller as the Flash. So that brings on a whole other segment of problems. DC, interestingly, so far in 2022, DC has had two blockbuster properties. The Peacemaker TV series by James Gunn, which was wildly popular, critically well-received by the comic book community, and by all indications was a fan favorite. And also the release of the Batman movie by Matt Reeves, which critically acclaimed, has grossed over $750 million worldwide at the box office. So DC properties recently are doing very well. Now, talking about it from the comic book collecting aspect and the secondary market, kind of how does DC compare to Marvel in terms of moving the secondary market? Well, there are a couple of problems. And I'm only going to touch on a few things on this video. Number one is we'll look at those two characters and compare them to characters that have recently had huge gains for Marvel Comics. So for Marvel, in the last few months and upcoming, we had the release of Spider-Man No Way Home. We're currently in the run of the Moon Knight TV series and eagerly anticipating Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. Now, those three main characters, let's take a look at their first appearances. Spider-Man's first appearance was in Amazing Fantasy 15 in 1962. That's one of the most sought-after comic books on the market, but it is available. The CGC census has 2,302 universal-graded copies of that book. Keep that number in mind. Moon Knight, which came out 13 years later, and Werewolf by Night 32 has a total of 4,257 universal graded copies according to the CGC census, almost twice as many. Now, keep in mind, Werewolf by Night was not one of Marvel's more popular titles, nor was Amazing Fantasy at that point. It was the last issue before cancellation. So compared to other Bronze Age titles, Moon Knight didn't have as wide a release of, let's say, Hulk 181 or Amazing Spider-Man 129, or even some number ones like Giant Size X-Men. The first appearance of Doctor Strange in Strange Tales 110 in 1963, just the year following Amazing Fantasy 15, has a total of 1,772 on the CGC census, about 530 fewer than Amazing Fantasy 15. Now let's compare that to DC. Now, Batman, along with Spider-Man, is arguably DC's most popular character and their most marketable one. We've seen so many different iterations of Batman in the movies, on TV, in animated form, as we have seen with Spider-Man. And we're kind of building more awkwardly than Marvel did, not as cohesively. We're going to see 3 versions of Batman upcoming very soon. We've already seen Robert Pattinson. We're going to see Ben Affleck, and we're going to see Michael Keaton. That being said, Batman's first appearance is back in 1939 in Detective Comics 27. There are a total of 36 universal blue label copies on the CGC census. So, many fewer than Amazing Fantasy 15. It's not even comparable. Amazing Fantasy 15 has what's 2,300 divided by 36? I should be able to do this, but I'm on vacation. And it's late at night. We're talking about more than 60 times as many copies of Amazing Fantasy 15. So just think about that. For every copy of Detective Comics 27 that has been graded, you would come across more than 60 copies of Amazing Fantasy 15. Even Fighting 5, number 40, which is from 1966, so it's a more recent title than either the first appearance of Spider-Man or Doctor Strange. Fighting 515 is the first appearance of Peacemaker, which was published by Charlton Comics in 1966. The Charlton line was later bought by DC in the 1980s and incorporated into their line of stories in the 1980s with Crisis on Infinite Earths. Universal graded copies of Fighting 5 number 40 are 111. So still a fraction of what we see of either the first appearance of Spider-Man or Doctor Strange. Now, Peacemaker doesn't have a history of being as big a character as either of those two. But I do suspect that there aren't that many more copies out there. It is a tough book to find. So the DC Comics, when you compare them to Marvel, with the exception of Namor and Captain America and Bucky, all of the Marvel first appearances are from 1962 forward. Almost all of the DC first appearances of their major characters are in the 1940s. Superman, Batman, Robin, Wonder Woman. Some of the other Golden Age versions of Flash or Green Lantern. Even the Barry Allen Flash or the Hal Jordan Green Lantern are characters that premiered in the 1950s. So those books are even a little bit harder to find than their Marvel counterparts. So let's take a look at some similarities. I'm going to take a look at 4 books that have popped in value in the last year for characters that premiered in the 1980s. 1 for Marvel and 3 for DC. And we will see some similarities in how the market has treated them. So let's look at the Marvel character first, and that is Mobius M. Mobius, played by Owen Wilson in Loki. His first appearance was in Fantastic Four 353. So let's take a look at the GPA analysis of that book, and let's look at the Fantastic Four 353. The book was stagnant, not really selling, had an average price of under $100 until boom, it just spiked suddenly when Loki premiered, and it hit a high value of about $600 and change, and then it came crashing down, and it's kind of remained stagnant at a little less than half that price. So it got up over 600. Now it's a little bit, it's closer in the 200 and change range. So that was a book that was completely driven by the appearance of the character in the MCU. Let's take a look at a similar DC book, and that would be Superman #4, which is the first appearance of Bloodsport, who was played by Idris Elba in the Suicide Squad movie. Now, both Owen Wilson and Idris Elba are established Hollywood stars. And here, again, we see this book kind of languishing in the $60 range for a 9.8. We're just looking at 9.8s because they're modern books. And then, boom, a spike here up to the into the 200s in August when there was a new trailer released, and it became evident that Elba was going to play a more significant part in the narrative than people initially thought. Then the movie came out in July, and boom, it spiked up again. Average price in the mid 200s and a high sale of $375. I sold that book. So and then it's come down again and normalized in the range of about $100. So about cut in half again, which isn't surprising. Now, both of these characters, Mobius and Bloodsport, are characters that we're going to see again. There could be room for those books to spike up again, but we saw a similar trajectory. However, the Mobius book got into the $600 range, and the Bloodsport book barely got into the $300 range. So the Fantastic Four book was about twice as expensive. Now, let's take a look at a couple of other characters that have, and these are both DC. Detective Comics 385, which is the first appearance of the Ratcatcher. Okay. It was a Detective Comics book, so Batman books do have their value. And in 2020, it was going in the 160 range, and then we knew the character was coming, and then actually the movie came out, and the book got up to about $300, similar to Bloodsport. It came down, but now it's been going up again as people are speculating that James Gunn is going to do another Ratcatcher property similar to what he did with Peacemaker. And so that book is actually now at an all-time high. One sold for $450. So that's in the $400 range. It's actually gone up since the release of the Suicide Squad movie. So could we see that happen with Bloodsport as well if we see Idris Elba connected to another project? Now, the last one we're going to look at is New Teen Titans Annual #2, the first appearance of Adrian Chase, Vigilante. Book languished, around $100. It always had some value because I believe it was a George Perez cover. I think that's what gave it its $100-ish value, right? And then it started to climb as we knew the character was coming, and then all of a sudden Peacemaker comes out, and the book spikes close to $400. Now, it's kind of gone down. We haven't really seen enough time go by to see how much that book is going to level off at. But similar trajectories, but none of the three DC books have gone up in relation to the Fantastic Four 353. Now, we're dealing with a small sample size, but all within the same range. The Fantastic Four book is the youngest book of the crop, having come out in 1991, whereas Bloodsport was in 87, Ratcatcher in 88, and Vigilante in 83. Other than Ratcatcher, the other three have similar CGC numbers in terms of universal grades. Superman 4 has 669. 36% of those are graded 9.8. Fantastic Four 353 has 529, 27 graded at CGC 9.8. And New Teen Titans Annual 2 has 765, the most, about 100 more than Superman 4, 36.6%. Even though it's the oldest, it has the highest percentage of 9.8s. Now, the Ratcatcher book only has 137 on the census, and only 24.8% of those are CGC 9.8. So that book is harder to find in a CGC case, and also harder to find in a 9.8. And that may be driving up the value right now. It'll be interesting to see how many more copies of that book come to market in the next, let's say, 6 months to a year. So I think that's one way we can kind of look at comparing Marvel and DC. Look at books that are similar. These were books that were spiked by an obscure character that became a character in a TV show, and all of a sudden the books are going up into the hundreds. However, the Marvel book, with similar numbers in terms of the CGC census, commands more money. So I think what that tells us is, bottom line, Marvel is demanding more. There's more of a demand in the back issue secondary market than for the DC books. But the DC books, in some cases, aren't as plentiful, even when we're talking about similar eras. And so this is something we can expand upon. Now, where is DC going? What's happening in the future? Is it going to change any of the projects? We do have a number of other projects that are coming out. Batgirl, which is a late Silver Age premiere of that character. Supergirl, which is an early Silver Age premiere of that character. And the Blue Beetle, which is a modern character. Green Lantern, which has a number of characters. Alan Scott is supposedly involved in that HBO Max series. That Try to Find All American 16. That is a ghost. Even Showcase 22 is a book from the 1950s that's a little bit harder to find. But some of the others, Green Lantern 59, the first appearance of Guy Gardner. Green Lantern 87, the first appearance of John Stewart. And Green Lantern 49 from Volume 2, or actually Volume 3. The first appearance of Kyle Rayner. Some of the other Green Lantern-based characters, there are a lot of them. There are those characters like, let's say, Kilowog. The Green Lantern 25, which has, the first Larfleeze and Atrocitus, a whole bunch of other characters. There's opportunity for those books to have spikes. Now, the other question is, what is going to happen with The Flash? There's a fan movement for Grant Gustin from the TV series to take over Ezra Miller's role. I believe there's also a possibility they could completely recast the role and just have a multiversal thing. That's possible. It depends on how much Warner Brothers wants to invest in Ezra Miller in the future. And I don't know what's happening with this film, because this seemed to be the linchpin for driving the narrative going forward, having Michael Keaton as Batman instead of Ben Affleck. So you'd have to be changing the timeline. It'll be interesting to see what happens there. One option that I think is feasible, which is what we saw in the 1980s in the comic books, is Wally West. We already introduced, they introduced Iris West in the Snyder Cut. I don't know if they will introduce her brother or nephew, however they're going to couch it. They had it as her brother on the TV series. How they're going to use that in the animated series, I don't know. Or in the theatrical film. I don't know if they're going to introduce Wally West, but it's certainly something they could do and have him take on the mantle of Flash, much like Wally West did following Barry Allen's death in Crisis on Infinite Earths. In that case, Flash 110, which is a double key. It's also the first appearance of Weather Wizard, and it's an early Flash book. That's the first appearance of Wally West as Kid Flash. That book could spike in value, and that is much like some of these Marvel keys. That's a true Silver Age book. It is of the same vintage as some of the early Marvel books. For instance, Flash 110 is it's actually from a cover date December 59, January 1960, and there are 522 universally graded copies on the census, which again is less than a quarter of the copies of Amazing Fantasy 15. So it is a scarce book. I'm not comparing Kid Flash to Spider-Man, but I'm saying that since it's like 3 years earlier, it is much more difficult to find. I'd be interested to do. I think I'm going to do a series where I'm going to like lay out keys from the similar eras for DC and Marvel. I think that's something worthwhile to do. Now, what do you think DC is going to do with Ezra Miller? What are they going to do with their properties? Are they going to have a more cohesive universe? The movie, The Batman, that came out starring Robert Pattinson as Batman, we talked about Detective Comics 27 with 36 universally graded copies. That is not a book that the vast majority of collectors will ever even think about owning. It just doesn't exist. And the first appearance of Catwoman Joker in Batman #1 is not much better. And so what we saw happen with Batman Keys, Penguin, Riddler, all of these characters premiered in the Golden Age. Those books are tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars in high grade. Their Silver Age first appearances are more affordable. And so they're kind of quasi keys, secondary keys, but still keys because those are books that people can afford. People can say, okay, I'm going to put together the Silver Age Batman villains first appearances. And that is something that is doable for a serious collector. But what is going to happen with the Flash? That's really the question that I have. And I'm not sure that Warner Brothers knows the answer. The other thing is who will be leading, will be kind of the Kevin Feige for DC Comics. And how much are they going to emulate the success that Marvel has had? Are they going to interconnect everything? My guess is that there's going to be the DC Extended Universe. There are people that will push for the Snyder Cut. We already know what the storyline he intended for Justice League is, so I don't think you can go there because everything has already been spoiled. And I'm not sure that Zack Snyder is the man to put in charge. His movies were not particularly well received, and they didn't really rival the Marvel movies at the box office. I think for the most part, they were disappointments. I think they might need to look in a new direction. Is James Gunn the solution? There was talk about J.J. Abrams being in that role. Now, my guess is there'll be the DC Extended Universe, which will have the Justice League, so they'll connect Flash and Shazam and Aquaman and maybe Superman. Maybe this is an entry point for Henry Cavill to come back in. There's also the idea of using then they have the Batman universe, which is much grittier. You're not going to probably see crazy science fiction or magical characters in that. You're going to see more street level, and they're building properties around that. And then maybe they'll just go multiversal and do stories that are disconnected, much like Todd Phillips' The Joker. They could do a lot of what they do in the comics in terms of Black Label. They could do other properties in that vein. And also remember, DC just, 2 years ago, had the Watchmen limited series, what it turned out to be on HBO, which was hugely well received, won Emmy Awards all over the place for that series. So there is something there for DC. It just hasn't been put together. And I think the difference between Marvel and DC is that there's not that interconnectedness. It's not like you see a character in one property and you're like, oh, I'm going to see that character again and again and again. Look at Ratcatcher. Completely obscure character. And the character we have in the Suicide Squad movie isn't even a character from the comics. It's the daughter of that character. That is a character. Now we're thinking we're going to see potentially Ratcatcher again. Maybe James Gunn is going to do something else with that character. Now all of a sudden the book is spiking up again. Whereas character like Bloodsport, which we're not sure about, the book has basically had its value cut in half and kind of stayed there. Does have the opportunity to move again. So who's going to be in charge? I think that's a big question. What direction are they going to go in? I don't think they're going to just follow the Marvel path. although they can take some of the elements because, for no other reason, the Marvel movies make a lot of money. And I'm sure Warner Brothers Discovery wants to make a lot of money. The other thing is, if you think historically, the comics, they stole ideas from each other all the time. If you look at Marvel and DC Comics, there are so many parallel characters. I mean, Fantastic Four came out after Justice League. Even look at the cover of Brave and the Bold 28 and FF1. Look at Doom Patrol and X-Men. I don't think they were created in a vacuum. Jim Starlin has gone on his record as saying that he modeled Thanos after Darkseid. Man-Thing and Swamp Thing came out almost at the same time because the two writers were roommates. These parallel stories and these borrowing as the creators went back and forth. Let's face it, Eternals was basically a reset of New Gods that Jack Kirby started at DC, which was actually a reset of Tales from Asgard that he started at Marvel. And then he went and created other gods, the Eternals, when he returned to Marvel in the mid-70s. So the two companies are so closely aligned, and not for nothing, so are their fan bases. Some people may like Marvel more, some people may like DC more. The one thing I do hope is on the comic book side that they'll broaden the appeal of characters who are not Batman related. They really need to now, who knows what they're doing with the Justice League going forward with their stable of the legendary characters. We do have the newer versions of the characters. We've seen that work for Marvel, but readers still want to see Clark Kent, Bruce Wayne, Tony Stark, Steve Rogers. Those are characters they want to see. They may like the new characters as well. Yeah, we like Miles Morales, but we also love Peter Parker. So anyway, this is Jim saying until next time, enjoy your comics.